All right, let's talk a little bit about trade. Um, Now, I know in the notes it says trade is good, but you'll hear me use this phrase sometimes. Trade is magic. It is. Trade is magic, and I'll explain why in a little bit. Um, let's talk a little bit first about something that economists call the principle of voluntary exchange. So let's say that you and I want to make a trade. Okay, or we're contemplating a trade, and I say, okay, I'm going to give you $1 and you're going to give me your cell phone. Sounds like a great trade to me. um but you're not into that. Okay. So then the trade doesn't happen because it was going to make me better off, but it was going to make you worse off. But what if instead, you say, "Oh, well, I'll give you my cell phone and you can give me $10,000." And I go, "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa." Okay, so it was going to make you better off and it's going to make me worse off. And so the trade didn't happen. But if you have a trade where I agree and you agree, okay, it's a voluntary thing, and we trade, then that trade made us both better off. And you go, well, how do you know that it made both people better off? Well, and this is where a little theory comes in. If it didn't make me better off, I wouldn't have traded. If it didn't make you better off, you wouldn't have traded. So if we both voluntarily um, made that trade, then it makes sense that it made both of us better off. Okay. Um, Now, I mentioned here there's a lot of caveats to this. One of the biggest ones that you got to zoom in on is the principle of voluntary exchange. This has to be something where both parties um, are doing this voluntarily. They completely know what's going on in the trade. Um, we'll talk about what happens if that's not the case. But this is why. Well, one of many reasons why slavery is you know horrible is that it wasn't a voluntary thing. One side was benefiting and the other side wasn't, because this wasn't a voluntary thing on their behalf. Um, there's a lot of places where the line between voluntary and involuntary is very blurred. For example, let's say that I get in a serious accident and the ambulance comes to pick me up and they say, okay, we will drive you to the hospital, we will save your life, and it'll only cost you $200,000. And I agree. Okay, I agreed to it, they agreed to it, we both benefited. um, but you can argue whether or not that was truly a voluntary exchange. If the choice is $200,000 or death, I'm going to pick $200,000. And you start to understand why healthcare is so expensive, because some of these exchanges um, aren't entirely voluntary, and we may not have great information about it. Um, there's also stuff like child labor. Um, Child labor, you can kind of question, how voluntary is it? Are they being forced to by their parents? Um, when you don't necessarily have good alternatives, is this really voluntary? Um, so, so again, there's kind of some shadowy lines there about what is considered voluntary and what's not. Um, but with those caveats aside, overall, trade is magical. And I'll tell you why I say that trade is magic. Okay, after I said all of those other depressing things, 99.99% of the objects that you encounter on a daily basis, um, the car that you drove here in, the road that you drove it on, um, the cell phone that you have in your pocket, all of these things you could not have made, not in 100 years. Okay. You don't have the expertise, you don't have the raw materials, all of these things, you could not have produced it on your own. But instead, you specialized in knowing one or two things that you can do, and you trade for those things. I, all I do for a living is teach people. I teach them math, computer science, economics. But when I check out at the grocery store, you know, um, you know, I I don't know how to grow my own food. I don't know how to build a car or a computer or any of that. So all I'm able to do is take my knowledge of math and computer science and economics and trade it for a car that I couldn't build in 100 years. I'm able to consume things that I would never be able to produce. And how am I able to do that? I'm able to do it because all of us have specialized and we've traded. There are a lot of folks out there who have this idea that people should do things like for themselves. Like you should grow your own food. You should do everything yourself. And I think there's some primitive joy in that, like eating a vegetable that grew in your own garden. I'm not saying that any of this is necessarily bad in and of itself, but if you look at cultures who almost everyone is a farmer, these are poor cultures because if everyone is only taking care of their own needs, they're not specializing. They're um, they're just doing just the bare minimum. Um, but when you're able to specialize, you're able to afford the tools to produce more. You have the specialized knowledge to produce more. You can create the organization to produce more. And although you're not taking care of all of your own needs, you are producing more. And through all of that extra production and all of that extra trade, that's how we're able to live the life we live right now, where we have people who sing for a living and you know um, and enforce laws for a living and all of the other little things that we do, um, because we specialize and we trade with each other, and each of those little trades we become a little bit better off than we were before. Trade is good. Trade is magic because it allows us to consume more than we would be able to produce on our own. And we'll talk about that a lot more later. Um, one other thing I wanted to mention, economists overwhelmingly, agree with this principle that trade is good. And you'll also see them overwhelmingly against policies that interfere with free trade. Now, that's not universally true, but for example, tariffs. If you haven't heard of a tariff is when you charge an import tax when you import something from another country. And you're going to find that economists are overwhelmingly against this. They are very much in favor of exporting things to other countries and importing things into our country and trading as freely as possible between nations. There's some places where this gets a little more complicated, which we'll talk about later, but just know in general, um, these policies that interfere with free trade generally are going to hurt more than they help. So we'll talk more about trade later, but just know that trade is good.